So in the final decades of the 19th century, as America experienced unprecedented industrial growth and urban expansion, a massive wave of Italian immigration began transforming the social and criminal landscape of major American cities. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians crossed the Atlantic, seeking economic opportunity and escape from the poverty and political instability that plagued their homeland. Among these millions of honest, hard-working immigrants were a small but significant number of individuals who brought with them criminal traditions and organizational methods that would forever change American organized crime. The Sicily of the 1880s was a land shaped by centuries of foreign domination, feudal exploitation, and endemic violence that had created unique social structures and survival mechanisms. The formal unification of Italy in 1861 had done little to improve conditions for ordinary Sicilians, who found themselves caught between the conflicting demands of a distant central government, local landowners who maintained quasi-feudal control over vast estates, and various criminal organizations that had emerged to fill the vacuum left by weak governmental authority. The Mafia, or Cosa Nostra as it was known to its members, represented the most sophisticated of these criminal organizations, operating according to strict codes of conduct that emphasized personal honor, family loyalty, and absolute silence about organizational activities. The economic conditions that drove Sicilian emigration were characterized by extreme poverty, limited opportunities for legitimate advancement, and systematic exploitation by landowners who controlled both agricultural production and local political institutions. The majority of Sicilians lived as agricultural laborers or small tenant farmers whose survival depended on the whims of wealthy estate owners and the vagaries of agricultural markets that offered little security or hope for improvement. The unification of Italy had actually worsened conditions for many ordinary Sicilians by imposing heavy taxation, military conscription, and centralized administration that seemed to benefit northern Italian interests at the expense of southern regions. The decision to emigrate represented both desperation and hope for families who had exhausted other options for escaping poverty and creating better lives for their children. The journey across the Atlantic was expensive, dangerous, and emotionally devastating, requiring emigrants to leave behind everything familiar while venturing into an unknown world where language barriers, cultural differences, and ethnic prejudice created additional challenges. Most Italian immigrants arrived in American ports with limited financial resources, few marketable skills that translated to industrial economies, and virtually no connections to established communities that could provide assistance during the difficult transition period. The urban environments that greeted Italian immigrants in cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New Orleans were characterized by overcrowding, poor sanitation, dangerous working conditions, and endemic ethnic tensions that made survival a daily struggle. Italian immigrants found themselves concentrated in the worst neighborhoods, competing for unskilled labor positions that offered minimal wages and no job security, while confronting discrimination from both employers and established ethnic communities that viewed them as unwelcome competitors for scarce resources and opportunities. The Little Italy neighborhoods that emerged in major American cities during this period served as both refuges from hostile external environments and breeding grounds for the social tensions and criminal opportunities that would later characterize early American organized crime. These neighborhoods, while providing essential cultural and economic support for struggling immigrant families, also recreated many of the social hierarchies and power dynamics that had existed in Sicily, including the informal systems of justice and protection that operated outside official legal channels. The legitimate Italian-American community leaders who emerged during this period included successful businessmen, religious figures, and political organizers who worked to improve conditions for their compatriots while also fighting negative stereotypes and discriminatory policies that affected all Italian Americans, regardless of their individual character or activities. These leaders understood that the criminal activities of a small minority could damage the reputation and opportunities of the entire Italian American community, creating ongoing tensions between different segments of the immigrant population. The Black Hand extortion operations that began appearing in Italian American neighborhoods during the 1890s represented the first systematic criminal enterprises that drew upon Sicilian criminal traditions while adapting to American urban environments. These operations, typically conducted by small groups of criminals who targeted successful Italian-American businessmen and professionals, involved threatening letters decorated with symbols of death and violence that demanded payment for protection from unspecified but ominous consequences. The effectiveness of Black Hand operations depended on the cultural knowledge and psychological understanding that the perpetrators possessed about their potential victims. Italian immigrants, particularly those from Sicily and southern Italy, understood the implications of these threats based on their knowledge of similar criminal activities in their homeland, while American law enforcement agencies initially struggled to comprehend either the methods being employed or the cultural factors that made these extortion schemes so successful within Italian-American communities. The reluctance of victims to report Black Hand activities to American police reflected both cultural traditions that emphasized family and community-based solutions to personal problems and practical concerns about the effectiveness of law enforcement agencies that seemed unable to understand or respond appropriately to these types of criminal activities. This reluctance created environments where extortion operations could flourish, while also establishing patterns of non-cooperation with official authorities that would later facilitate more sophisticated criminal enterprises. Giuseppe Morello, who arrived in New York from Sicily in 1892, exemplified the kind of criminal entrepreneur who recognized the opportunities that American urban environments provided for traditional Sicilian criminal methods. Morello possessed extensive experience in extortion, counterfeiting, and violent crime that had characterized his activities in Sicily, while also demonstrating the adaptability and strategic intelligence necessary to modify these methods for success in American cities. His criminal organization, which operated primarily in East Harlem and surrounding areas, provided a template for the more sophisticated criminal enterprises that would later dominate American organized crime. The Morello organization's activities included counterfeiting operations that took advantage of the multiple currencies and banking systems that existed in late 19th century America, extortion schemes that targeted both Italian-American and other ethnic communities, and various forms of violent crime that established territorial control while eliminating potential competitors. These activities required coordination between multiple participants, sophisticated understanding of law enforcement limitations, and systematic methods for disposing of evidence and protecting organizational security. The barrel murder case of 1903, which involved the discovery of Benedetto Madonia's body stuffed in a barrel in East Harlem, demonstrated both the violent methods that characterized early Sicilian American criminal organizations and the challenges that American law enforcement faced in investigating crimes that involved complex networks of relationships and cultural factors that were poorly understood by investigators. This case, which generated enormous media attention and public concern about Italian-American criminal activities, also established patterns of sensationalistic reporting that would later influence public perceptions about organized crime. The New Orleans lynchings of 1891, which resulted in the deaths of 11 Italian-Americans following the assassination of police chief David Hennessy, illustrated the dangerous intersection between ethnic prejudice, criminal activity, and vigilante justice that characterized American responses to Italian-American organized crime during this formative period. These events, which occurred after a controversial trial failed to convict the accused assassins, demonstrated both the limitations of conventional legal processes and the explosive potential of ethnic tensions that surrounded Italian-American criminal activities. The political implications of the New Orleans incident extended beyond local concerns to include diplomatic tensions between the United States and Italy that required intervention by federal authorities and international mediation to resolve. These diplomatic complications demonstrated the broader significance of Italian-American criminal activities and established precedents for federal involvement in local criminal cases that would later prove important for the development of national organized crime investigation and prosecution capabilities. The Prohibition movement that gained momentum during the early 20th century created unprecedented opportunities for criminal organizations that possessed the combination of entrepreneurial vision, operational expertise, and systematic violence necessary to exploit the contradictions between public policy and popular demand for alcohol. Italian-American criminal organizations, with their established networks, territorial control, and experience in illegal enterprises, were uniquely positioned to take advantage of these opportunities in ways that would transform both their own operations and the broader landscape of American organized crime. The economic transformation that occurred in American cities during the early 20th century created both legitimate opportunities for immigrant advancement and criminal opportunities for those willing to operate outside legal constraints. The growth of urban markets, industrial employment, and commercial activities provided contexts where criminal enterprises could flourish while also offering cover for activities that required interaction with legitimate businesses and institutions. Italian-American criminal organizations adapted to these changing conditions by by developing more sophisticated operational methods and expanding their activities beyond traditional neighborhood-based enterprises. The labor conflicts that characterized American industrial development during this period provided additional opportunities for criminal organizations that could offer alternative solutions to workplace disputes and labor management problems. Italian-American criminal groups, with their experience in providing protection services and managing territorial conflicts, found ready markets for their services among both employers and workers who were dissatisfied with conventional approaches to labor relations and industrial conflict resolution. The gambling enterprises that proliferated in American cities during this period reflected both changing social attitudes toward recreational activities and the failure of official policies to address popular demand for entertainment that operated outside traditional moral and legal constraints. Italian-American criminal organizations, drawing upon extensive experience in managing gambling operations in Sicily and southern Italy, developed sophisticated American gambling enterprises that served diverse customer bases while maintaining the security and profitability that characterized successful criminal businesses. The political corruption that enabled early organized crime activities involved systematic relationships between criminal organizations and elected officials, law enforcement agencies, and judicial institutions that provided protection from prosecution while facilitating expansion of criminal enterprises. These relationships, based on mutual benefit and shared financial interests, created political environments where criminal organizations could operate with minimal interference while also influencing policy decisions that affected their business interests and territorial control. The Tammany Hall political machine in New York City exemplified the kind of systematic political corruption that provided essential infrastructure for organized crime development during this period. The machine's control over municipal appointments, law enforcement policies, and judicial processes created opportunities for criminal organizations to purchase protection and influence that enabled long-term strategic planning and investment in sophisticated criminal enterprises. Similar political machines in other major cities provided comparable opportunities for criminal organizations to establish themselves as permanent features of urban political and economic landscapes. The ethnic succession that characterized American urban development during this period created both opportunities and challenges for Italian-American criminal organizations as they competed with established Irish and German criminal groups, while also adapting to changing demographic patterns that affected customer bases and territorial control. This competition required strategic alliances, territorial negotiations, and occasional violent conflicts that shaped the evolution of organized crime activities and established precedents for inter-ethnic criminal cooperation that would later prove important for national criminal enterprise development. The generational changes that occurred within Italian-American communities during this period created tensions between immigrant parents who maintained traditional Sicilian values and customs and their American-born children who were adopting American cultural patterns and social expectations. These generational differences influenced both legitimate community development and criminal organization evolution, as younger Italian-Americans possessed cultural knowledge and social connections that enabled criminal enterprises to expand beyond traditional ethnic boundaries while maintaining organizational cohesion based on family relationships and ethnic loyalty. The legitimate businesses that served as fronts for criminal activities represented essential components of early organized crime operations, providing both cover for illegal activities and methods for integrating criminal proceeds into the conventional economy. These businesses, typically restaurants, import companies, construction firms, and various service enterprises, required genuine business expertise and customer relations skills that complemented the criminal capabilities of their operators while maintaining credible appearances that could withstand casual scrutiny from law enforcement agencies and business competitors. The violence that characterized territorial disputes and organizational conflicts during this period reflected both Sicilian criminal traditions and American urban conditions that required systematic use of intimidation and elimination to maintain criminal enterprise security and profitability. This violence, while generating negative publicity and law enforcement attention, also served essential business functions by establishing reputations for decisive action that reduced the need for actual violent confrontations while influencing competitor behavior and customer compliance. The newspaper coverage that sensationalized Italian-American criminal activities during this period contributed to both public awareness of organized crime as a significant social problem and ethnic stereotyping that affected all Italian-American Americans regardless of their individual character or activities. This coverage, while sometimes providing accurate information about criminal activities, also reflected broader cultural anxieties about immigration, ethnic diversity, and urban social change that influenced American responses to organized crime throughout the 20th century. The law enforcement responses that developed during this formative period included both innovative investigative techniques that recognized the distinctive characteristics of organized crime activities and discriminatory policies that reflected ethnic prejudice and cultural misunderstanding. These responses, while sometimes achieving short-term success in disrupting specific criminal operations, generally failed to address the systematic nature of organized crime or the social conditions that enabled criminal organizations to flourish in American urban environments. The federal involvement in organized crime investigation that began during this period reflected recognition that criminal activities increasingly crossed state boundaries and involved interstate commerce in ways that exceeded the capabilities of local law enforcement agencies. This federal involvement, initially limited to specific cases involving postal fraud, counterfeiting, and interstate transportation of stolen goods, established precedents for expanded federal authority that would later prove essential for systematic organized crime investigation and prosecution. By 1920, Italian-American organized crime had evolved from scattered groups of extortionists and street criminals into sophisticated criminal organizations that possessed territorial control, systematic revenue sources, political protection, and organizational structures that would enable them to take advantage of the unprecedented opportunities that Prohibition would provide. The foundation that had been established during these formative decades included not only operational capabilities and criminal expertise, but also cultural knowledge and social networks that would prove essential for the dramatic expansion that would characterize the next phase of American organized crime development. The stage was now set for the transformation of these neighborhood-based criminal organizations into national criminal enterprises that would dominate illegal alcohol production and distribution, while establishing the organizational templates and operational methods that would define American organized crime throughout the 20th century. The lessons learned during these early decades about territorial control, political corruption, ethnic cooperation, and systematic violence would provide the strategic framework for criminal enterprises that would soon rival legitimate corporations in their scope, sophistication, and influence over American economic and political institutions. The ratification of the 18th Amendment on January 16, 1920, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the United States, represented one of the most transformative moments in American criminal history. This ambitious attempt at social engineering, born from decades of temperance advocacy and moral reform movements, created unprecedented opportunities for criminal enterprises that possessed the organizational skills, territorial control, and systematic violence necessary to satisfy public demand for illegal alcohol. For Italian-American organized crime groups, Prohibition represented nothing less than a pathway to unprecedented wealth, power, and national influence. The immediate aftermath of Prohibition's implementation revealed the fundamental disconnect between legislative intent and social reality that would characterize the entire noble experiment. Despite the hopes of temperance advocates who believed that legal prohibition would transform American social behavior and moral culture, public demand for alcohol remained strong across all social classes and geographic regions. This persistent demand created enormous profit opportunities for individuals and organizations willing to operate outside legal constraints while providing goods and services that millions of Americans continued to desire. The economic mathematics of illegal alcohol were staggering and unprecedented in American criminal history. A bottle of whiskey that cost 50 cents to produce legally could be sold for $6 or more on illegal markets, representing profit margins that exceeded anything available through conventional business activities. These extraordinary profit margins, combined with the massive scale of public demand, created opportunities for wealth accumulation that transformed neighborhood criminals into millionaire businessmen within remarkably short periods. The Italian-American criminal organizations that had been developing since the 1880s possessed crucial advantages that enabled them to dominate illegal alcohol markets in ways that individual criminals or informal partnerships could not match. Their established territorial control provided secure bases of operations. Their experience with systematic violence enabled them to protect shipments and eliminate competitors, and their existing relationships with corrupt political figures provided essential protection from law enforcement interference. Most importantly, their organizational structures and cultural traditions emphasized emphasized the kind of disciplined cooperation and absolute secrecy that large-scale criminal enterprises required to operate successfully over extended periods. Chicago emerged as the most significant center of illegal alcohol operations during Prohibition, reflecting both the city's strategic geographic location and its deeply corrupted political environment that provided ideal conditions for organized crime expansion. The city's position as a transportation hub for the Great Lakes region, combined with extensive railroad connections to major population centers throughout the Midwest and East, made it a natural distribution center for illegal alcohol produced in Canada, transported from overseas, or manufactured in clandestine American facilities. Alphonse Al Capone's rise to dominance of Chicago's illegal alcohol trade exemplified the transformation that Prohibition enabled for ambitious criminal entrepreneurs who possessed the combination of strategic intelligence, operational ruthlessness, and political sophistication necessary to build and maintain large-scale criminal enterprises. Capone, who arrived in Chicago in 1919 as a relatively minor figure within Johnny Torrio's criminal organization, demonstrated remarkable ability to recognize and exploit the opportunities that Prohibition created, while systematically eliminating competitors and building relationships with political figures who could provide protection and advance warning of law enforcement activities. The organizational structure that Capone developed for his Chicago operations represented unprecedented sophistication in American criminal enterprise management, incorporating specialized divisions for production, transportation, distribution, enforcement, and political relations that functioned with the efficiency and coordination of legitimate corporations. This structure enabled systematic management of complex supply chains that stretched from Canadian distilleries to neighborhood speakeasies, while maintaining security protocols that protected operations from law enforcement infiltration and competitor interference. The production facilities that supplied illegal alcohol markets during Prohibition ranged from sophisticated industrial operations that rivaled legitimate breweries and distilleries to primitive basement stills that produced dangerous and often poisonous products. The larger operations, typically controlled by organized crime groups with sufficient capital and political protection, employed experienced craftsmen and quality control measures that ensured consistent products that could compete effectively with pre-Prohibition alcoholic beverages. These facilities required substantial initial investments, ongoing operational security, and systematic distribution networks that could move products efficiently from production sites to retail markets. The transportation networks that moved illegal alcohol from production facilities to distribution points represented logistical challenges that required military-level planning and coordination. These networks incorporated multiple transportation modes, including ships, trucks, airplanes, and railroad cars, each requiring different security measures and operational procedures. The most successful operations developed redundant transportation routes and backup systems that could maintain supply continuity even when individual shipments were intercepted by law enforcement agencies or hijacked by competitor organizations. The retail distribution systems that brought illegal alcohol to consumers evolved to include both sophisticated establishments that catered to wealthy customers and neighborhood outlets that served working-class communities. Speakeasies, which operated as illegal bars and social clubs, provided controlled environments where alcohol consumption could occur with relative security, while also serving as meeting places where criminal organizations could conduct business and maintain relationships with customers, suppliers, and political contacts. These establishments required careful management to maintain security while providing attractive environments that could compete with pre-Prohibition legitimate establishments. The enforcement methods that organized crime groups employed to protect their territorial interests and maintain organizational discipline represented systematic applications of violence that exceeded anything previously seen in American criminal enterprises. The territorial wars that characterize Prohibition-era organized crime involved not only individual elimination, but also systematic campaigns designed to destroy competitor organizations while demonstrating the consequences of challenging established territorial boundaries or organizational interests. The Valentine's Day Massacre of February 14, 1929, which resulted in the elimination of 7 members of the George Bugs Moran organization in a Chicago warehouse, demonstrated both the operational sophistication and strategic ruthlessness that characterized organized crime enforcement during this period. The careful planning, tactical execution, and psychological impact of this operation reflected the kind of systematic violence that enabled successful criminal organizations to maintain territorial control while discouraging potential challengers from attempting to establish competing operations. The corruption of law enforcement agencies that accompanied Prohibition represented systematic institutional failure that enabled organized crime operations to flourish with minimal interference from official authorities. This corruption involved not only individual police officers and federal agents who accepted payments for ignoring specific criminal activities, but also systematic arrangements that provided comprehensive protection for entire criminal enterprises. The amounts of money that illegal alcohol operations generated enabled criminal organizations to purchase levels of official protection that had never before been possible in American criminal history. The political relationships that organized crime groups developed during Prohibition extended beyond simple corruption to encompass genuine political influence that affected policy decisions, electoral outcomes, and governmental operations at multiple levels. Criminal organizations possessed financial resources that exceeded those of many legitimate businesses and political organizations, enabling them to influence political processes through campaign contributions, voter mobilization, and systematic bribery that reached the highest levels of municipal, state, and federal government. The federal law enforcement response to Prohibition violations represented unprecedented expansion of federal police authority that would have lasting implications for American criminal justice and constitutional law. The creation of specialized federal agencies and the deployment of federal agents throughout the country to enforce alcohol prohibition established precedents for federal involvement in criminal activities that had previously been considered purely local matters. However, the massive scale of public non-compliance and systematic criminal organization made effective enforcement extremely difficult, even with enhanced federal resources and authority. The Treasury Department's prohibition enforcement efforts, led by agents like Elliot Ness and his Untouchables team in Chicago, demonstrated both the potential effectiveness and fundamental limitations of federal law enforcement responses to systematic organized crime activities. While these efforts achieved some tactical successes in disrupting specific criminal operations and prosecuting individual criminal figures, they failed to address the underlying economic incentives and social conditions that enabled illegal alcohol markets to flourish despite intensive law enforcement pressure. The international dimensions of illegal alcohol trade during Prohibition created relationships between American organized crime groups and criminal organizations in other countries that would have lasting influence on American organized crime development. The importation of alcohol from Canada, the Caribbean, and Europe required coordination with foreign suppliers and smuggling networks that provided American criminal organizations with international experience and connections that would later prove valuable for other criminal enterprises, including controlled substance trafficking and money laundering operations. The technological innovations that organized crime groups adopted during Prohibition demonstrated their ability to embrace new methods and equipment that enhanced operational effectiveness while providing competitive advantages over less sophisticated criminal competitors. These innovations included advanced communication systems, transportation technologies, and production methods that enabled more efficient and secure criminal operations while reducing exposure to law enforcement detection and intervention. The money laundering operations that enabled organized crime groups to integrate their illegal alcohol profits into the legitimate economy represented early development of sophisticated financial management techniques that would later characterize modern organized crime enterprises. These operations required establishing relationships with legitimate financial institutions and businesses that could provide methods for converting cash proceeds from illegal activities into apparently legitimate assets and investments. The labor union relationships that organized crime groups developed during Prohibition provided additional sources of income and political influence, while also creating opportunities for legitimate business investments that could serve as fronts for criminal activities. The systematic infiltration of labor unions enabled criminal organizations to influence major construction projects, transportation operations, and industrial activities while providing employment opportunities for criminal associates and sources of intelligence about legitimate business activities that might be vulnerable to criminal exploitation. The entertainment industry relationships that emerged during Prohibition reflected the intersection between illegal alcohol operations and legitimate business activities that required similar skills in customer relations, entertainment management, and marketing. Many speakeasies and illegal gambling establishments evolved into sophisticated entertainment venues that competed directly with legitimate establishments while providing cover for criminal activities and meeting places where criminal and legitimate business could be conducted simultaneously. The regional expansion that characterized organized crime during Prohibition involved establishing operations in multiple cities and states that required coordination and cooperation between criminal organizations that had previously operated independently within limited territorial boundaries. This expansion created needs for systematic communication, standardized operational procedures, and conflict resolution mechanisms that would later influence the development of national organized crime structures and leadership hierarchies. The Atlantic City Conference of 1929, which brought together criminal leaders from throughout the United States to discuss territorial boundaries, operational coordination, and conflict resolution, represented the first systematic attempt to organize American criminal activities on a national scale. This meeting, while not creating formal organizational structures, established precedents for cooperation and communication that would later influence more sophisticated attempts at national criminal organization and coordination. The economic impact of illegal alcohol operations during Prohibition extended far beyond the immediate profits earned by criminal organizations to encompass broader effects on legitimate businesses, tax revenues, and economic development patterns. The enormous amounts of money generated by illegal alcohol created alternative economic structures that competed with legitimate businesses while providing capital for investments and activities that would have lasting influence on American economic development. The social consequences of Prohibition-era organized crime included both the glamorization of criminal figures who were often portrayed as successful businessmen providing popular services and the normalization of systematic violence and corruption that accompanied criminal enterprise operations. These social effects influenced American cultural attitudes toward crime, law enforcement, and governmental authority in ways that would affect criminal justice policies and public responses to organized crime throughout the 20th century. The generational changes that occurred within organized crime during Prohibition included the emergence of American-born criminal leaders who possessed cultural knowledge and social connections that enabled them to expand criminal operations beyond traditional ethnic boundaries while maintaining organizational cohesion based on family relationships and ethnic loyalty. These younger leaders combined traditional Sicilian organizational methods with American business techniques and marketing approaches that enhanced the effectiveness and profitability of criminal enterprises. The legitimate business investments that organized crime figures made during Prohibition, using profits from illegal alcohol operations, created foundations for long-term wealth accumulation and political influence that would persist long after Prohibition ended. These investments in real estate, construction companies, restaurants, and various service businesses provided both money laundering opportunities and genuine business expertise that would prove valuable for post-Prohibition criminal enterprise development. The legal innovations that developed during Prohibition included both enhanced federal law enforcement authorities and judicial procedures that would later prove important for organized crime prosecution efforts. The systematic investigation and prosecution of criminal organizations during this period established precedents for conspiracy prosecutions, financial investigations, and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies that would influence 20th century criminal justice approaches to organized crime. The repeal of Prohibition through the 21st Amendment in 1933 represented both the end of an era of unprecedented criminal opportunity and the beginning of a new phase in organized crime development that would require adaptation to changed legal and economic conditions. The criminal organizations that had prospered during Prohibition possessed accumulated wealth, political relationships, and organizational expertise that enabled them to transition successfully to other criminal enterprises while maintaining their dominant positions within American organized crime hierarchies. The legacy of Prohibition-era organized crime included not only the specific criminal organizations and individual leaders who had achieved prominence during this period, but also the operational methods, organizational structures, and cultural influences that would shape American organized crime throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The lessons learned about systematic corruption, territorial control, and political influence during Prohibition provided templates for criminal enterprise development that would prove adaptable to changing legal, economic, and social conditions in subsequent decades. By 1933, Italian-American organized crime had been transformed from neighborhood-based criminal groups into sophisticated criminal enterprises that possessed national influence, enormous financial resources, and organizational capabilities that rivaled those of legitimate corporations. The foundation established during Prohibition would soon support the next phase of organized crime development, where the lessons learned about systematic criminal enterprise management would be applied to the creation of formal organizational structures and national coordination mechanisms that would define American organized crime for generations to come. Thus, the end of Prohibition in 1933 confronted American organized crime with its greatest strategic challenge since the initial Italian immigration of the 1880s. The elimination of illegal alcohol as a primary revenue source threatened to destroy the economic foundation that had enabled unprecedented criminal wealth accumulation and organizational expansion during the previous 13 years. However, this apparent crisis also created opportunities for visionary criminal leaders who recognized that long-term success required fundamental transformation of organized crime from opportunistic criminal enterprise to systematic business organization based on territorial coordination, operational efficiency, and strategic planning that could adapt to changing legal and economic conditions. Salvatore Lucania, who had adopted the more American-sounding name Charles Lucky Luciano, emerged as the most innovative and influential architect of this transformation. Born in Sicily in 1897 and brought to America as a child, Luciano possessed both intimate knowledge of traditional Sicilian criminal methods and sophisticated understanding of American business practices and social dynamics that enabled him to envision and implement organizational changes that would define American organized crime for generations to come. Luciano's strategic vision recognized that the traditional structure of Italian-American organized crime, dominated by older leaders who maintained strict ethnic boundaries and territorial limitations, was inadequate for the complex criminal opportunities that post-Prohibition America offered. These older leaders, contemptuously referred to as mustache Petes by younger, more American-oriented criminals, represented approaches to criminal enterprise that emphasized personal honor, ethnic purity, and traditional methods over efficiency, profitability, and adaptive strategic planning that modern criminal enterprises required for long-term success. The systematic elimination of old guard leadership that became known as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers represented one of the most dramatic organizational transformations in American criminal history. This coordinated series of strategic eliminations, conducted simultaneously in multiple cities throughout 1930 and 1931, removed traditional leaders who opposed modernization while establishing new leadership structures based on business competence and strategic vision rather than simply ethnic credentials and traditional authority. Joe Masseria, who had dominated New York organized crime through traditional methods that emphasized personal loyalty and ethnic solidarity over systematic business organization, represented the kind of leadership that Luciano recognized as obsolete in post-Prohibition criminal environments. Masseria's elimination on April 15, 1931, in a Coney Island restaurant marked the symbolic end of traditional Sicilian criminal leadership and the beginning of a new era based on American business principles and organizational efficiency. The subsequent elimination of Salvatore Maranzano, who had briefly assumed leadership of New York's Italian-American criminal organizations following Masseria's death, demonstrated Luciano's understanding that lasting organizational change required not merely leadership succession, but fundamental restructuring of criminal enterprise according to modern business principles. Maranzano's vision of traditional Sicilian criminal hierarchy, based on quasi-feudal relationships and ethnic exclusivity, conflicted with Luciano's more expansive and adaptive approach to criminal organization. The commission system that Luciano established to replace traditional leadership structures represented unprecedented innovation in criminal organization that combined elements of corporate governance with practical mechanisms for territorial coordination and conflict resolution. This system, modeled on legitimate business boards of directors, created formal structures for communication and decision-making that enabled systematic coordination between independent criminal organizations while maintaining operational autonomy that preserved entrepreneurial incentives and reduced vulnerability to law enforcement penetration. The five-family structure that emerged in New York following these leadership changes reflected both practical considerations about territorial organization and strategic recognition that systematic coordination required manageable organizational units that could maintain internal discipline while participating effectively in broader criminal cooperation. These families, eventually led by Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, and Tommy Lucchese, possessed complementary strengths and territorial advantages that enabled comprehensive coverage of New York's criminal opportunities while maintaining competitive incentives that encouraged operational efficiency and innovation. innovation. The territorial agreements that the Commission negotiated to prevent destructive conflicts between competing criminal organizations represented sophisticated understanding of the economic costs associated with criminal warfare and the business advantages that systematic cooperation could provide. These agreements, while not eliminating all sources of conflict, created frameworks for dispute resolution and territorial coordination that reduced the kind of violent competition that had characterized earlier periods of organized crime development. The expansion of criminal enterprises into legitimate businesses that accelerated during this period reflected both the accumulated capital that Prohibition had provided and strategic recognition that long-term criminal success required integration with conventional economic activities that could provide both cover for illegal operations and genuine sources of legal income. This expansion involved systematic investment in businesses that could serve criminal purposes while maintaining credible, legitimate appearances that could withstand increased law enforcement scrutiny. The construction industry provided particularly attractive opportunities for criminal investment and control, offering both enormous legitimate profits and extensive opportunities for criminal exploitation through bid rigging, union manipulation, and various forms of fraud that generated additional revenue, while creating political influence through control over major development projects. The systematic infiltration of construction unions and contractor associations enabled criminal organizations to influence billions of dollars in construction activity while maintaining apparently legitimate business profiles. The garment industry in New York became another focus of systematic criminal infiltration and control, reflecting both the industry's vulnerability to labor disruption and its dependence on rapid production cycles that made it susceptible to extortion and protection rackets. Criminal control over key unions and trucking companies enabled systematic extraction of tribute from legitimate businesses while providing employment opportunities for criminal associates and cover for other illegal activities. The labor racketeering operations that emerged during this period represented sophisticated criminal enterprises that exploited the complex relationships between workers, employers, and government regulators to generate steady revenue streams while providing genuine services that all parties found valuable, despite their illegal nature. These operations required detailed understanding of labor law, collective bargaining processes, and industrial economics that enabled criminal organizations to position themselves as indispensable intermediaries in legitimate business relationships. The trucking and transportation industries provided additional opportunities for criminal control and exploitation, particularly in major metropolitan areas where complex logistics and time-sensitive delivery schedules made businesses vulnerable to disruption and delay. Criminal control over key transportation unions and companies enabled systematic extortion of legitimate businesses while creating opportunities for cargo theft, hijacking, and various forms of fraud that supplemented traditional criminal revenue sources. The gambling operations that expanded significantly during this period reflected both continuing public demand for illegal gaming opportunities and the organizational sophistication that criminal groups had developed through their Prohibition-era experiences. These operations, ranging from neighborhood numbers games to sophisticated casino-style establishments, required careful coordination between multiple participants while maintaining security from law enforcement interference and protection from competitor encroachment. The numbers racket, which provided daily gambling opportunities for working-class communities throughout major American cities, represented particularly significant revenue sources that generated steady cash flows while requiring extensive organizational networks that employed hundreds of collectors, runners, and managers. These operations provided both criminal income and legitimate employment opportunities for community members while creating customer loyalty and political influence that protected operations from law enforcement interference. The political relationships that organized crime developed during this period extended beyond simple corruption to encompass systematic influence over electoral processes, policy development, and governmental decision-making that affected business interests, criminal enforcement priorities, and regulatory policies. This political influence, purchased through campaign contributions, voter mobilization, and systematic bribery, created protective environments that enabled long-term strategic planning and investment in criminal enterprises. Frank Costello's emergence as the Prime Minister of the underworld exemplified the sophisticated political influence that organized crime could achieve through systematic cultivation of relationships with elected officials, judges, and administrative personnel who controlled governmental processes that affected criminal enterprises. Costello's ability to influence major political appointments and policy decisions demonstrated the extent to which criminal organizations had become integrated into American political structures at the highest levels. The international connections that organized crime maintained and expanded during this period included relationships with criminal organizations in Italy, particularly Sicily, that provided sources of expertise, personnel, and coordination for criminal enterprises that crossed national boundaries. These relationships, based on shared cultural backgrounds and criminal traditions, enabled importation of experienced criminal personnel and coordination of criminal activities that required international cooperation. The controlled substance operations that began expanding during this period reflected both changing social attitudes toward various illegal substances and the organizational capabilities that criminal groups had developed for managing complex supply chains and distribution networks. These operations, initially focused on traditional substances like opium and cocaine, required international connections, sophisticated security measures, and systematic distribution networks that could operate without law enforcement detection over extended periods. The money laundering operations that became increasingly sophisticated during this period reflected both the enormous cash flows generated by various criminal enterprises and the need for systematic methods of integrating criminal proceeds into the legitimate economy without attracting law enforcement attention. These operations required establishing relationships with legitimate financial institutions and businesses that could provide methods for converting cash proceeds into apparently legal assets and investments. The enforcement mechanisms that maintained organizational discipline and territorial control during this period combined traditional methods of systematic violence with more sophisticated approaches to conflict resolution and business competition. The commission system provided formal mechanisms for resolving disputes between criminal organizations while maintaining credible threats of violent enforcement that discouraged violations of territorial agreements and organizational protocols. The recruitment and training procedures that criminal organizations developed during this period reflected both the need for reliable personnel and the importance of maintaining operational security in increasingly complex criminal enterprises. These procedures emphasized family relationships and neighborhood connections as indicators of potential loyalty, while requiring demonstrated competence in relevant criminal specialties and absolute adherence to organizational security protocols. The generational succession planning that began during this period reflected recognition that long-term organizational survival required systematic development of younger leaders who could adapt to changing conditions while maintaining organizational continuity and cultural identity. This planning involved careful evaluation of potential successors' capabilities, loyalty, and strategic vision, while providing advanced education in criminal enterprise management and political relationship building. World War II created both challenges and opportunities for organized crime operations, as wartime economic controls, rationing systems, and labor shortages created new criminal opportunities, while also subjecting criminal activities to enhanced governmental scrutiny and control. The black market operations that flourished during wartime provided enormous profit opportunities for criminal organizations that possessed the connections and operational capabilities necessary to circumvent official rationing and price control systems. The military procurement fraud that occurred during wartime involved systematic exploitation of governmental contracting processes through bid rigging, product substitution, and various forms of financial fraud that generated enormous profits while also contributing to national defense efforts in ways that created protective political relationships. These operations required sophisticated understanding of governmental procurement processes and systematic corruption of officials responsible for contract administration and quality control. The post-war economic expansion that began in the late 1940s created unprecedented opportunities for legitimate business investment and criminal enterprise development as American society experienced dramatic social and economic changes that affected criminal opportunities, law enforcement capabilities, and public attitudes toward various forms of criminal activity. The suburban expansion, industrial growth, and social mobility that characterized this period provided new contexts for criminal enterprises while also creating new challenges for maintaining organizational cohesion and territorial control. The Kefauver Committee hearings of 1950-1951, which provided the first systematic public examination of American organized crime, demonstrated both the extent of criminal influence over legitimate institutions and the challenges that democratic societies faced in responding to systematic criminal organization that operated through corruption and intimidation rather than simply violence and theft. These hearings created unprecedented public awareness of organized crime while also providing criminal organizations with intelligence about law enforcement capabilities and investigative priorities. The television broadcast of committee hearings brought organized crime figures into American homes for the first time, creating both public fascination with criminal personalities and political pressure for enhanced law enforcement responses to organized crime activities. Frank Costello's appearance before the committee, during which television cameras focused on his hands rather than his face, created iconic images that influenced popular culture representations of organized crime for generations, while also demonstrating the extent to which criminal figures had become integrated into legitimate American society. The legal and legislative responses that followed the Kefauver hearings included enhanced federal law enforcement authorities, increased resources for organized crime investigation, and new legal tools that enabled more effective prosecution of criminal enterprises that operated across state boundaries. These responses, while not immediately successful in disrupting established criminal organizations, established foundations for more systematic federal approaches to organized crime that would prove important in subsequent decades. By the early 1950s, the commission system and five-family structure that Lucky Luciano had established had created the most sophisticated and successful criminal organization in American history. This system combined operational efficiency with strategic coordination, territorial stability with entrepreneurial innovation, and traditional criminal methods with modern business practices in ways that enabled sustained prosperity and growth despite increasing law enforcement pressure and social change. The foundation that had been constructed during this transformative period included not only formal organizational structures and territorial agreements, but also cultural adaptations and operational methodologies that would enable American organized crime to maintain its influence and profitability through dramatic social, economic, and political changes that would characterize the remainder of the 20th century. The lessons learned about systematic organization, political influence, and business integration during this period provided templates for criminal enterprise development that would prove remarkably durable and adaptable to changing circumstances. The stage was now set for the golden age of American organized crime, when the organizational structures and operational methods developed during the Commission era would enable criminal enterprises to achieve unprecedented levels of wealth, political influence, and cultural prominence, while operating with apparent immunity from law enforcement interference that would make them seem virtually untouchable to both competitors and authorities who attempted to challenge their dominance of American criminal activities. The period from the early 1950s through the 1970s represented both the zenith of American organized crime power and the beginning of systematic challenges that would ultimately transform the criminal landscape that had been carefully constructed during the previous decades of organizational development. This era witnessed unprecedented criminal wealth accumulation, political influence, and cultural prominence occurring simultaneously with the emergence of federal law enforcement capabilities and investigative techniques that would prove increasingly effective against even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The post-war economic boom that characterized American society during the 1950s created extraordinary opportunities for both legitimate business expansion and criminal enterprise development. The massive construction projects, industrial growth, and suburban development that defined this period required enormous amounts of capital, labor coordination, and political cooperation that created ideal conditions for criminal organizations that possessed the financial resources, workforce control, and governmental relationships necessary to participate in and profit from this unprecedented economic expansion. The systematic infiltration of labor unions that had begun during the 1930s reached unprecedented levels of sophistication and control during this period, as criminal organizations recognized that union leadership provided access to enormous economic resources while creating opportunities for political influence that extended far beyond traditional criminal enterprises. Teamsters Union, in particular, became a primary target for criminal infiltration due to its central role in transportation and logistics that made it indispensable for virtually every aspect of American economic activity. Jimmy Hoffa's rise to leadership of the Teamsters Union exemplified the complex relationships that developed between criminal organizations and legitimate institutions during this period. While not himself a traditional organized crime member, Hoffa's willingness to cooperate with criminal figures in exchange for political support and his systematic use of union resources to enhance his personal power created partnerships that enabled criminal organizations to influence billions of dollars in economic activity while maintaining plausible legitimate cover for their activities. The pension fund control that criminal organizations achieved through union infiltration provided access to enormous amounts of capital that could be invested in both legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises without the scrutiny that conventional financial institutions applied to large loans and investments. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, in particular, became a virtual bank for organized crime investments in Las Vegas casinos, Florida real estate developments, and various legitimate businesses that served as both profit centers and money laundering operations. Las Vegas emerged during this period as perhaps the most visible symbol of organized crime's integration with legitimate American business and entertainment. The casino developments that transformed Las Vegas from a small desert town into a major entertainment destination were financed largely through criminal organizations' access to union pension funds and their ability to coordinate complex construction projects that required both enormous capital investments and systematic management of regulatory and political challenges. The Flamingo Hotel, developed by Benjamin Bugsy Siegel with financing and management support from various East Coast criminal organizations, provided the template for subsequent casino developments that combined legitimate entertainment businesses with systematic criminal enterprises including illegal gambling operations, money laundering activities, and various forms of fraud that generated enormous profits while maintaining the appearance of conventional business operations. The systematic skimming operations that characterized Las Vegas casinos during this period represented sophisticated criminal enterprises that required coordination between casino management, accounting personnel, and various criminal organizations that possessed both the political protection and operational security necessary to conduct large-scale financial fraud without detection. These operations involved systematically removing cash proceeds from casino gaming operations before they could be reported to tax authorities, generating enormous untaxed profits that were distributed among various criminal organizations and invested in additional legitimate and criminal enterprises. The entertainment industry relationships that criminal organizations developed during this period reflected both the enormous profits available through control of popular entertainment venues and the cultural influence that such control provided. The systematic control of nightclubs, theaters, and music venues in major cities enabled criminal organizations to influence popular culture while generating legitimate profits and creating opportunities for various forms of criminal activity, including illegal gambling, controlled substance distribution, and systematic extortion of entertainers and venue operators. Frank Sinatra's relationships with various organized crime figures during this period illustrated the complex intersection between legitimate celebrity and criminal influence that characterized much of American entertainment during the golden age of organized crime power. While Sinatra himself was never proven to be involved in criminal activities, his documented friendships with criminal figures and his frequent performances at criminal-controlled venues demonstrated the extent to which organized crime had become integrated into mainstream American culture and entertainment. The controlled substance operations that expanded dramatically during this period reflected both changing social attitudes toward various illegal substances and the organizational sophistication that criminal groups had developed for managing complex international supply chains and domestic distribution networks. The heroin trade, in particular, became a major source of criminal revenue that required coordination with international suppliers, sophisticated smuggling operations, and systematic distribution networks that could operate in urban environments without law enforcement detection. The French Connection, which involved systematic importation of heroin from France through various East Coast ports, represented one of the most sophisticated international criminal enterprises of this period. This operation required coordination between American organized crime groups, French criminal organizations, and various legitimate businesses that provided cover for smuggling activities while maintaining operational security that protected participants from law enforcement detection and prosecution. The political influence that organized crime achieved during this period extended to the highest levels of American government, including documented relationships with elected officials, judicial personnel, and law enforcement administrators who provided protection and advance warning of potential threats to criminal operations. This political influence, while never achieving the systematic control that characterized some foreign criminal organizations, nonetheless created environments where criminal enterprises could operate with minimal interference from official authorities. The Kennedy administration's relationship with organized crime represented one of the most complex and controversial aspects of American political history during this period. While the Kennedy family's documented associations with certain organized crime figures suggested potential conflicts of interest, Robert Kennedy's aggressive prosecution of organized crime as Attorney General demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal political relationships could not guarantee complete protection from law enforcement attention. Robert Kennedy's systematic approach to organized crime prosecution represented the beginning of sustained federal law enforcement pressure that would eventually prove effective against criminal organizations that had previously seemed immune from conventional law enforcement methods. Kennedy's use of federal resources, enhanced investigative techniques, and coordinated prosecution strategies established precedents for systematic organized crime investigation that would influence law enforcement approaches for decades to come. The Appalachian Meeting of November 14, 1957, represented both the peak of organized crime confidence and the beginning of their systematic exposure to law enforcement and public scrutiny. This gathering, which brought together criminal leaders from throughout the United States for discussions about territorial coordination and organizational business, was discovered by New York State Police, who conducted surveillance and arrests that provided unprecedented evidence of the scope and coordination of American organized crime activities. The participants at Appalachian included criminal leaders from major cities throughout the United States, demonstrating the national scope of organized crime coordination and providing law enforcement agencies with detailed intelligence about criminal hierarchies and relationships that had previously been subjects of speculation and rumor. The arrests and subsequent investigations generated enormous media attention while providing prosecutors with evidence that would support various criminal cases for years to come. The public impact of the Appalachian revelations forced law enforcement agencies to acknowledge the existence of systematic organized crime coordination that extended far beyond local criminal activities, creating political pressure for enhanced federal law enforcement responses and congressional investigations that would provide additional intelligence about criminal operations and political corruption. These revelations also damaged the carefully cultivated image of successful businessmen that many criminal figures had developed, exposing them as participants in systematic criminal enterprises that operated according to traditional Sicilian criminal methods and organizational structures. J. Edgar Hoover's reluctant acknowledgement of organized crime as a significant law enforcement priority represented a fundamental shift in federal law enforcement philosophy that would have lasting implications for criminal organizations that had previously operated with minimal federal interference. Hoover's creation of specialized organized crime investigation units within the FBI and his authorization of enhanced surveillance techniques marked the beginning of systematic federal law enforcement pressure that would eventually prove devastating to established criminal organizations. The electronic surveillance capabilities that federal law enforcement agencies developed during this period provided unprecedented access to high-level criminal communications and decision-making processes that had previously been protected through sophisticated operational security measures. The court-authorized wiretaps and surveillance operations that resulted from these capabilities generated thousands of hours of recorded conversations that provided detailed evidence of criminal planning, organizational structure, and leadership decision-making that would prove impossible to dismiss through traditional defense strategies. The RICO, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which became federal law in 1970, provided law enforcement agencies with powerful new tools for prosecuting organized crime figures through systematic attacks on entire criminal organizations rather than individual criminal acts. This legislation enabled prosecutors to demonstrate patterns of criminal activity that established criminal enterprise participation rather than requiring proof of specific criminal acts, fundamentally changing the legal environment in which organized crime operated. The witness protection programs that federal authorities developed during this period provided systematic methods for encouraging cooperation from criminal organization members who possessed detailed knowledge of criminal activities but had previously been deterred from testifying by realistic fears of retaliation. These programs, while not immediately successful in generating widespread cooperation, established frameworks for witness protection that would later prove essential for successful organized crime prosecutions. The generational changes that occurred within organized crime during this period included the emergence of younger leaders who possessed different attitudes toward criminal enterprise, law enforcement cooperation, and organizational loyalty than their predecessors. These younger criminals, while maintaining traditional organizational structures and cultural identities, demonstrated greater willingness to cooperate with law enforcement authorities when faced with lengthy prison sentences and enhanced prosecution techniques. The drug trade expansion that accelerated during the 1960s created both enormous profit opportunities and unprecedented law enforcement attention that would prove increasingly difficult for criminal organizations to manage through traditional methods of political corruption and operational security. The social and political changes associated with controlled substance use during this period generated enhanced public concern and governmental resources that exceeded anything that criminal organizations had previously encountered. The cultural impact of organized crime during this period extended beyond immediate criminal activities to encompass significant influence on American popular culture, including movies, television programs, books, and music that portrayed criminal figures as romantic anti-heroes who represented alternative approaches to achieving success and respect in American society. This cultural influence, while providing some degree of popular sympathy for criminal figures, also generated increased public interest and law enforcement attention that complicated traditional criminal operational security. The international investigations that developed during this period revealed the extent to which American organized crime had established relationships with criminal organizations throughout the world, creating law enforcement challenges that required international cooperation and coordination that exceeded traditional American law enforcement capabilities. These investigations also demonstrated the global scope of criminal enterprises that had begun as neighborhood protection rackets and extortion operations. The labor racketeering prosecutions that intensified during this period targeted the systematic control that criminal organizations had achieved over major labor unions and the enormous economic influence that such control provided. These prosecutions, while achieving some tactical successes, also demonstrated the difficulty of removing criminal influence from institutions that had been systematically infiltrated over decades of careful relationship building and strategic investment. The legitimate business investigations that accompanied enhanced organized crime prosecutions revealed the extent to which criminal organizations had invested their accumulated wealth in apparently legitimate enterprises that served both as money laundering operations and genuine sources of legal income. These investigations complicated traditional approaches to criminal prosecution by requiring analysis of complex business relationships and financial transactions that involved both legitimate and criminal activities. The family succession issues that became prominent during this period reflected both the aging of criminal leaders who had established their organizations during earlier decades and the changing social and legal environments that created new challenges for maintaining organizational continuity and cultural identity. These succession issues were complicated by enhanced law enforcement surveillance and prosecution efforts that made traditional leadership development and selection processes much more difficult and dangerous. The law enforcement successes that began accumulating during this period included both significant prosecutions of high-level criminal figures and systematic disruption of criminal enterprises that had operated with apparent immunity for decades. These successes, while not immediately destroying established criminal organizations, demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises could be penetrated and prosecuted through sustained law enforcement effort and enhanced investigative techniques. The political reforms that accompanied increased awareness of organized crime influence, included enhanced oversight of government contracting processes, systematic investigation of political corruption, and legislative changes designed to reduce the opportunities for criminal influence over legitimate governmental and business activities. These reforms, while not eliminating criminal political influence, created additional obstacles and risks that complicated traditional methods of achieving political protection and governmental cooperation. By the early 1970s, the golden age of American organized crime was encountering systematic challenges that would prove increasingly difficult to manage through traditional methods of violence, corruption, and political influence. The federal law enforcement capabilities, legal authorities, and investigative techniques that had been developed during this period were beginning to demonstrate effectiveness against criminal organizations that had previously seemed untouchable, while social and cultural changes were reducing the community support and political protection that had historically enabled criminal enterprises to flourish with minimal interference. The foundation that had sustained organized crime dominance for nearly half a century was beginning to show significant cracks that would widen into fundamental structural failures over the following decades. The lessons learned about systematic criminal investigation, federal prosecution techniques, and international cooperation during this period would provide templates for law enforcement approaches that would eventually prove capable of dismantling even the most sophisticated and powerful criminal organizations in American history. The story of early American organized crime, from its origins in Sicilian immigration through its transformation during Prohibition and its ultimate achievement of unprecedented power and influence, demonstrates both the remarkable adaptability of criminal enterprises and the eventual effectiveness of sustained law enforcement pressure when supported by adequate resources, legal authorities, and political commitment. This history serves as a reminder that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations ultimately face limits imposed by democratic institutions and the rule of law when those institutions possess the will and capability to respond effectively to systematic criminal challenges. The legacy of this era continues to influence both American law enforcement approaches to organized crime and popular cultural perceptions of criminal enterprises, while the organizational methods and cultural traditions established during these formative decades provided templates that would influence criminal enterprise development throughout the world. The rise and eventual decline of early American organized crime illustrates the complex relationships between immigration, economic opportunity, political corruption, and criminal enterprise that continue to shape contemporary discussions about crime, justice, and social policy. This concludes our examination of one of the most fascinating and transformative periods in American criminal history, when traditional Sicilian criminal methods were adapted to American conditions and opportunities to create criminal enterprises that achieved unprecedented success before ultimately encountering the systematic law enforcement responses that would define the modern era of organized crime investigation and prosecution. For more deep dives into the stories that shaped our understanding of crime and justice, remember to subscribe to Sleep Crime, where we explore the complex realities behind the headlines and the lasting impact of choices that echo through generations.